Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Last week I was in a bit of a rush to chat about C-3000 and the general purpose frigate Goat Rodeo shortlisting, and I'll come back to that a bit later. And so I still have some unfinished business from the Submarine Institute of Australia conference, and I'm still seething about aspects of that, in particular the contribution from Chief of Navy Mark Hammond and his regular attack on the media. I dealt with that. He also lamented that journalists do not report on the positives, such as the good times when more than one Collins-class submarine is available. And I can provide Chief of Navy with a very simple explanation for that. It's because you won't tell us. It's pretty easy, I would have thought, to understand that even the most gifted journalist cannot report on something with zero information about it. And by the way, that's not just Navy. I've had variations of this at times from all three services. Why don't you write about all of the good things we do? Well, that's because you won't tell us. 90% of media inquiries are blocked by the Office of Defence Minister Marles. Even if you asked something like, what colour are RAF's aircraft painted? There's a very good chance that you will never receive a reply. The department itself, though, has now taken a further step down the path of trying to marginalise the media by putting out their own feel-good stories a couple of times a week, nice human interest tales about what people in the ADF are up to. And I have no idea if they're getting a run anywhere, but surely it would be cheaper and more effective to just be communicating directly with journalists working in the defence domain. Now, at the Submarine Institute event, Defence Minister Richard Marles appeared, as he usually does, and I'm quoting here. He was doing a Q&A. It's a rather strange format, but it's one that the conference likes. So, this is Marles. But it is important, and I guess what it highlights is that it is important that we have an ongoing and kind of granular conversation with the Australian people around the challenges we face. But the kind of defence force we are seeking to build, which is why this conference and what the Submarine Institute does is so important. Submarines aren't readily understood by people on the street, and yet they very much are the cornerstone of deterrence. Well, yes, you bet they are. Now, to me, this looks like absolutely the classic definition of hypocrisy. Say you are all about openness and transparency, but then do the exact opposite. And I note some Adelaide residents are now suddenly complaining that it's sheer madness for nuclear waste to be stored nearby where they live and that they knew nothing about this happening in the future. Well, welcome to AUKUS, and you ain't seen nothing yet. This is low-level nuclear waste. Wait until more people find out about what's involved in storing hundreds of tons of high-level nuclear waste. I've touched on that in previous podcasts, but undoubtedly it'll be a recurrent theme. And speaking of recurrent themes, and I'll try not to bore people, but it is just so important because billions and billions of dollars are at stake as are matters of national security, Australian national security. And it's the perennial one for me. What happens if the US is unable to build nuclear-powered submarines quickly enough for their own needs, let alone ours? And this always receives exactly the same non-answers in Australia about how everyone is committed to the program. Now, it might help if I give people a very simple analogy so that they can understand my frustration and understand what it is or how our government is behaving. Imagine this. Imagine you have a tight flight connection for something really important, a medical appointment, or maybe you are getting married, or you have an international connection. And you start to see reports that the airline is struggling with maintenance issues and that some flights are being cancelled. So you phone up a few days before and say, it's really vital that my flight from Canberra to Brisbane or wherever runs to schedule. Like, I mean, really life or death important. And you want some sort of reassurance that everything is going to be fine. The airline answers, well, of course it'll be fine. There's a schedule and we'll stick with it. But then you say, hang on, flights are being cancelled all the time and I want to know what happens if mine is cancelled. The answer is, we are fully committed to your flight departing on schedule. You ask, but hang on, what happens if it doesn't? And you get the same reply. We are fully committed to your schedule. Now, hopefully, people can understand why my nerves start to get frayed at this point, because this is precisely where we are in the AUKUS Pillar 1 discussion, or lack thereof it. But let's continue with the airline analogy. And you continue to say to the person at the other end of the phone, listen, I want to know if there's a fallback. It's very simple. Are there flights later on in the day that I can take? If there are, will I be automatically rebooked? When will I know which flight I'm on? Will it cost more? Now, these are all perfectly reasonable questions and the sorts of things many of us go through all the time, especially if you ever have the misfortune to fly Jetstar Asia. However, the answer that you keep on getting suddenly becomes, well, it's un-Australian for you to question us. How dare you? We are fully committed to your flight, and your lack of loyalty to this airline is appalling and only encourages the competition. Now, can people see where I'm going with this? The simple reason why the government and coalition keep trotting out this nonsense is that they don't want anyone understanding just how weak the basis of this entire deal is. If people understood that the chances of receiving second-hand nuclear-powered submarines from the US currently seem to be diminishing because production is slowing down, not speeding up, I've dealt with that before, then people might start to ask awkward questions such as, why are we transferring $4.6 billion to massively profitable US submarine shipbuilding companies? Why is there no refund clause? Why are we spending another $3 billion training people to maintain and operate submarines when there's a good chance they will never be delivered? And I wonder about Labor Party backbenchers in all of this, because I know how hard many of them have to work just to get something like a $10,000 grant for a community hall or something like that. And at the same time, they're seeing their ministerial colleagues authorize billions and billions of dollars with no accountability being handed over to US companies. And by the way, I'm not opposed to all spending connected with AUKUS. I mean, some of it makes sense. The infrastructure to support the US deployment of Virginia-class submarines here from 2027 makes sense to me. I just wish as a country our politicians were mature enough to talk about US forces being based here rather than use the very feeble argument that somehow rotational forces are different from one permanently here. It amounts to the same thing. Now, on the US, we've had, of course, the election of Donald Trump. He started to fill in key positions in his administration. The new US Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, he is a middle-rank Army veteran who seems to have impressed Trump with his Fox News performances. Some questions have been raised about whether or not the Senate will confirm him for the position. I suspect that a Republican-controlled Senate dominated by President Trump, that they'll do whatever they're told. And I'm not sure why Australian journalists waste precious time asking the same question over and over again about being able to work with him. The only possible answer that you will ever get from an Australian minister is, yes, of course. I mean, no one in their right mind is going to say something like, oh, well, I don't know, he seems like bit of a dodgy character. I'm not sure that he knows that much about running a big complex area. No, of course, they'll never say that. So I just don't see the point of asking the same thing over and over again when you know precisely what the response is going to be. And speaking of which, time-wasting questions being repeated, Kevin Rudd, Australia's ambassador to Washington. Now, this has taken up far more airtime than it warrants. I've been really surprised by at times the obsession that some parts of the media have with this. So I'm not going to myself be a hypocrite and add a lot to that, other than to point out the obvious. The job of an ambassador is to convey the views of the government to the leadership of the host nation. Anything else on top of that, whether they like him or not, is a bonus. It's not for the US or any other country to tell us who our ambassador should be. And this carry-on about Rudd having said some negative things about Trump somehow disqualifies him is just cultural cringe at its worst. There are plenty of Americans who have said awful things about Trump, including both his vice president and his secretary of state designate. And they have not only survived, but they have prospered, because what seems to matter to President-elect Trump is not what you said about him in the past, it's what you say about him now. And the genesis of all of this seems to have been a Nigel Farage interview, that UK far-right stirrer, who interviewed Trump several months ago, and Farage said something like, "The Australian ambassador says you are an idiot and a lowlife. What do you say to that?" And Trump, clearly having no idea at all who Kevin Rudd was, replied completely predictably, "Well, I've heard he's a nasty guy with low IQ." Now, I know Kevin Rudd, and I'll paraphrase another far less successful ALP leader when I say Kevin will have no problem joining a very long conga line of bootlickers trying to ingratiate themselves with the new president after January the 20th. And for Australians critical of Rudd, would these people dare say a single thing should Trump send a totally unqualified person to Australia? Of course not. And for people talking up once again the US-Australia friendship and these unbreakable bonds, when Trump was previously president, he didn't even bother appointing an ambassador to Australia until near the end of his term. So that just goes to show how much he thinks about us. Now, as promised, a few words about C-3000, general purpose frigate. The story has been broken about 10 days ago that the shortlist is Germany, ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems, and Japan. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, or in fact the Japanese procurement agency, ATLA. No denials of that have come out either on or off the record, and there appears to have been some form of communication with the losing bidders that they are out of the picture. So why the continuing official silence? Now, I know the bureaucracy moves slowly, except when they are destroying Taipan helicopters, but this project is meant to be super urgent, and I'll be doing my best to cover it during the next 12 months or so, hampered by the obvious fact that the bidders risk jail if they speak with me or any other journalist. Thank you, Department of Defence rules, fully supported by Ministers Marles and Conroy. Now, the only reason for the government trying to conceal what is going on is that this exercise looks like being a disastrous waste of money, because no one has had the political courage to push back against the fatally flawed Surface Fleet Review. If we continue going down this preordained path for C-3000, it will be a disaster for Australian industry, it will be a disaster for the Royal Australian Navy, and it will be the first time since 1976, almost 50 years ago, that Australia has purchased surface combatants from overseas. This is the disaster that we are embarking on, and the government and defence don't want people to know how badly they have fouled all of this up. And having very cunningly mentioned the destruction of the Taipan fleet, I hope you can see what I did there. I'll now circle back to the most recent Senate estimates hearings. Astute listeners will recall the Chief of Army, Simon Stewart, objects to the word destroyed in reference to the fate of the Taipans. Now, during Senate estimates, Liberal Senator David Fawcett, who I know quite well, and he has been pursuing the whole Taipan fiasco, asked Major General Jeremy King, he is the one who misspoke about Black Hawks having a weather radar when, in fact, they will have no such thing. Senator Fawcett asked about the cost of disposing of the Taipans, and I'll now read directly from the transcript. This is Major General King. We started with 47 airframes for MRH-90. Of those, 28 have been destroyed in recent months, 2 aircraft being sold back to NHI. We have 2 going to the Army Flying Museum in Oakey. The one that was involved in the accident remains under investigation. We have a further 14 that remain in Townsville and will be destroyed before the end of this year. See, everyone? He says destroyed twice. I wonder what Chief of the Army thinks of that. I mean, it's almost as if he's happy with this concept of destruction. And by the way, he ignored the question about how much this exercise is costing the Australian taxpayer. What a disgrace, and what a difference those helicopters would have made in Ukraine. And when we look at what's going on in Ukraine, again, I'll try and give a little bit of context. After Russia illegally seized Crimea in 2014, and then after the invasion of 2022, about 20% of the surface area of what used to be Ukraine is now under Russian occupation. But that also means that several million people can no longer be counted as Ukrainians, and an estimated 7 million have moved to other countries because of the conflict. So this means that the population of Ukraine effectively is about the same size as Australia's, or perhaps even slightly less. Now, try and imagine for a moment, if you would, the situation if we were fighting for our lives against a completely unjustified invasion, and we were losing a minimum of 500 young men being killed and wounded every week, and on top of that, a whole lot of civilian casualties as well. This is how desperate the situation is in Ukraine. It's too early to know if they're going to be left stranded high and dry by the Trump administration. In a very welcome piece of news that's just come out, the US has finally agreed to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles against targets inside Russia. Up until now, Ukraine has been fighting with one hand behind its back. It started to receive a few F-16s. That's going very slowly. Some French Mirage fighters are on the way, but times are really desperate there. And I think it's important for all of us, all Australians, to really understand the gravity of the situation. Yes, Australia now is pitching in with M1A1s, but there's a whole lot more that we can be doing, and we should, because if Ukraine were to fall, it's going to embolden dictators and tyrants all around the world, and I can assure everyone that would be a disaster for Australia. Okay, that's it for this episode. Thank you very much for listening. Bye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.